A South Florida prosecutor announced plans to dig through and reverse thousands of old crack convictions based on an illegal practice. To discuss it, we're joined by retired DEA agent Mark Baughman. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
And Jacksonville criminal defense attorney Shannon Schott. Good morning, Shannon.
Hey, good morning.
So, Shannon, I think a lot of people were surprised to hear about this policy of the Broward County Sheriff's Office back in the late 80s and 90s. Tell us a little bit about what they were doing.
Sure. It has come out through the efforts of Mr. Pryor's office that in 1988 to 1990, in around 1988, there was a find in a Greyhound station of a significant amount of cocaine. Normally, the sheriff's office would destroy anything that wasn't tied to an active investigation, but instead they decided to send it to the Broward County Sheriff's Crime Lab and manufacture crack cocaine. They then use that crack cocaine to go into predominantly low-income neighborhoods with mostly Black and brown people and do reverse buys, which is when the officer is undercover and acts not as someone purchasing the drugs to catch the dealer, but as the dealer trying to catch people who are ultimately just addicted to crack cocaine.
And you say Mr. Pryor, that's the Broward County prosecutor, Howard Pryor. So he may or may not have known that this was happening. I mean, he's a much later tenured prosecutor down there, and this was happening obviously long before he was there.
Correct.
Under a former sheriff named Sheriff Nick Navarro. But the Florida Supreme Court at some point weighed in on this practice. Is that right?
They did. In 1993, in a case called State v. Williams, Florida Supreme Court said that this behavior from the law enforcement officers was outrageous and therefore a due process violation, and that people could not be charged with this crime moving forward. The problem is that ruling was not retroactive, meaning all of the people who were prosecuted from 1988 to 1993, or anyone who had cases pending, were prosecuted, and certainly there was a lot of collateral consequences related to those charges because, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, in 1983, they started the Florida sentencing guidelines, and they abolished parole in the state of Florida. The Florida sentencing guidelines, the first iteration in 1983, had a huge problem where there was a disparate impact on people who were charged with possession or sale or delivery of crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine or other substances. And so they realized and actually revised the sentencing guidelines in 1994 statewide because of this high impact on crack cocaine users and abusers who were being sentenced to significant prison time as a result of the guidelines.
And the Florida Supreme Court, as you say, found that this was a due process violation, but they actually found that this constituted governmental misconduct. So
Yes.
It wasn't just a bad practice. They found that it was an illegal practice.
Absolutely. Yep. Because it was so outrageous.
Yeah. And so those arrested in these stings, Mark Baughman, this was obviously happening at a local law enforcement agency in Broward County. You worked with the federal drug enforcement agency for many, many years. How unusual was the idea of this? I mean, as far as we know, this was the only law enforcement agency in Florida and possibly the nation that was manufacturing crack cocaine. But in your mind, where does that rank in terms of unusual and strange practices?
You know, to manufacture it is unusual. But I can tell you, I came on with DEA in 1987. So I was at the height of this between 87 and, say, 96. Yeah, every decade, there's a different drug that becomes the drug of choice. Crack cocaine happened to be that drug between the late 80s all the way almost through the 90s until methamphetamine became a big, highly abused drug. I can tell you that DEA participated in these undercover sting operations. We did. We went out with state and locals here, even locally here in Jacksonville back in the day. Didn't have to manufacture or create it. What we seized off the streets was used again and just recycled, and or because you could use a counterfeit substance that looked like crack cocaine, represent it, as crack cocaine and sell it back.
One thing that was interesting about this case was that they were saying in part the reason that they were doing this practice was it prevented them from having to verify that the drug was actually crack cocaine.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as far as the sentencing guidelines go, in federal guidelines, 5 grams or more back in 94 when the crime bill was passed, you got 5 years minimum mandatory if you possessed it. Well, actually, no one got arrested or prosecuted for possession, but they did for distribution. When you look back, and again, there were undercover sting operations where undercovers were selling it, but there were undercovers going out and buying it too. Just a different type of a situation was set up. And keep in mind that, if arrests were down, especially with these sheriffs that get elected every 4 years, they want to show to the public that they're addressing it in some manner. So they jack the numbers up a little bit with these charges. And back then in the late 80s and 90s, I don't think you saw much pretrial intervention. You didn't see, you didn't have, at least here in Jacksonville, you didn't have the community control division where you put, people get diverted into a drug program.
No drug court.
No drug court. I mean, if it was very minimal. So now, we've advanced, all right, and law enforcement's advanced with that, I believe. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, these people, they suffered felony convictions. So now they may not get a job. It's going to minimalize them because they're addicts mainly. It's funny we should say, it was in the African-American community where it was being distributed, but most of the violators we were arresting were Caucasians going down there and buying. And there was the crime that was resultant of that was coming out was people were getting robbed, there were shootings, there were all types of things that were going. So I think because it's epidemic proportion, we were doing everything in our power to address it any way we could. So no one looked at it and dismissed it at that time. They didn't care about the after effect of it. Law enforcement does their thing. They arrest people and they move on, right?
If you're just joining us, we are talking about a new effort to reverse crack cocaine convictions that date back decades. You can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out and tag us on social media. I want to take a call from Kevin in Ponte Vedra. Good morning, Kevin. Go ahead.
Hey, hello, Ann. Thanks for taking the call. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Ponte Vedra. In 1989, I was the lead felony prosecutor in Broward County in the 17th Circuit. And it's called Operation Cradle, and I prosecuted a ton of these cases. The thing was, as the gentleman just said, it was being distributed. The setup was in the black community behind Dillard High School. People are familiar with Fort Lauderdale. But it was mostly working class white people and black people who were being arrested for purchasing the cocaine. Purchasing it is also a second-degree felony. What really bothered me about the whole situation is that you could go to if people know Fort Lauderdale, you could go to the bars along the Intracoastal Waterway, like Shooters or Dirty Nellies or places like that, where the yachts would pull up. They could see all the, I don't know what we would call them now, the South Beach types up in Fort Lauderdale. They were literally snorting powder off the bar, and nobody did anything about that. And I also would add that the sheriff, Nick Navarro, was very, very flamboyant, media savvy, and he is the individual who brought us the TV show Cops. That was his idea, and he spoke to some people, and that's why we had Cops.
And Kevin, I want to ask, since you say you prosecuted hundreds of these cases, and evidently they on some level troubled you. I mean, I guess it's worth reminding that as a prosecutor, it's not like you've got a lot of volition. I mean, you are basically bringing the cases that you are bound by law to bring.
Correct. Especially in Broward County, and I had a 3-year contract, and I fulfilled my contract. But in Broward County, there were like 3 or 4 layers you had to go through if you wanted to even drop a case. And it was very, very difficult, and it was all about your numbers. It was all about getting convictions or going to jury trial. I had a standard plea bargain that I offered people. As I said, I was the lead felony prosecutor, which meant I ran my own division. I would offer, if it was the first-time offender, a withhold of adjudication and 2 years probation, and a drug offender evaluation. Or if they had been convicted before, it would be an adjudication and 3 years probation. And everybody was fine with that. It was just a matter of the numbers. You could have a day of you go in court for your arraignments, and there would be 20 cases, and maybe 15 to 18 would be crack cocaine, and then the other cases would be home burglaries from people who were stealing because they were addicted to crack cocaine.
And so, Kevin, are you gratified to see this effort to go back into some of these old crack cocaine convictions and have them vacated?
I don't know if gratified would be the right word. I mean, these are cases we all went to work every day, and we knew we were going to be doing these cases. At a certain point, I kind of thought it was ridiculous. Let me choose my words carefully here. I know who the state attorney now is, Michael Satt, from 1976, and his last case was the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shootings. The individual that is in there now, there's a lot of politics going on there now. A lot of politics. And I'm sure there was a press release and a lot of look at me, look what I'm doing.
Well, Kevin, I wish we had a better connection because it's wonderful to hear your insights into those cases. And I would love to keep you on, but we do have kind of a digital problem there on the phone. Shannon, how surprising is it to hear this kind of take that Kevin presents as a former prosecutor of these very cases?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin's a great attorney. I know exactly who that was. And, he's got a lot of experience. And some of the prosecutors who are in Mr. Pryor's office right now,
that's the current prosecutor.
The current prosecutor's office are, saying they remember these cases and that, they remember at the time it not sitting right with them. There's law enforcement officers who have come forward. And Kevin's right. Immediate press release. This happened. From the time the press release was issued and them discovering that there was this issue in their archives was like days. So in the interviews that I've seen of Harold Pryor in the last week, it's been like, well, we haven't gone through all the files yet. This is new. This basically just happened. So certainly there's politics, but there will be collateral benefits for these individuals. One question for Kevin that I would have had is, how many of these people actually went to prison because of it, because of the guidelines, because of, prior existing records?
I do still have them on. I mean, like I said, Kevin, we're having connection problems, but did you hear Shannon's question?
Yes, I did. I don't know. Can you hear me? I'm on I-10 right now. But,
yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So the sentencing guidelines, completely different than they are now. If you were a first-time offender, it was anything from probation up to 2.5 years, up to 30 months in prison. And if you had been convicted previously, it was 3 years. It was 3 years in prison. But you had said something earlier about this was before Mr. Pryor's time. Honestly, this was 1988, 89. I don't think Harold was even born yet, to be quite frank with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been an attorney about 12 years now. He's probably about 36, 37 years old.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, I mean, certainly there are politics. There will be some good that comes out of this. But my fear is that people are in prison because of maybe not this charge, but the subsequent charges that they would have had if they were addicted to crack cocaine. And certainly what we know so far coming out of the Broward County State Attorney's Office is that they had archives that they were going through. It was brought to his attention by the appellate attorneys in the office that this State versus Williams case did not apply retroactively to thousands of cases, and they feel that they can go through the cases. There's actually prosecutors who are volunteering their time to go through these files, to track down these people, and that there are community-based providers who are going to help with things like clemency and, trying to seal and expunge records in order to absolve them from any of the consequences of these arrests. So,
Mark, I want to ask you, because this is an example of a different kind of disparity. We've talked before, and I think it's pretty well known that there were sentencing disparities when it came to crack versus powder cocaine. And there have been efforts just in recent years to undo that disparity. I think just as recently as 2022, interestingly, overturned under the Biden administration, but it was Senator Joe Biden who basically introduced and saw the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which established that disparity between crack and powder cocaine.
So in the state system, on a sentencing guideline, you probably get about 154 days gain time a year on a sentence. In the federal system, you do 85% of your time on a first-time offender. You only get 54 days gain time a year. So imagine that in the sentencing guidelines getting caught. Even distributors, even people selling crack federally back in the 90s, early 90s and 80s, they're still sitting in prison if they're doing a 360-month sentence. All right, because of that disparity on the guideline, because that 50-to-1 ratio crack versus powder, and or now it's ice because they've just shifted to methamphetamine, pure ice, and they do the measure and the quantification of what the percentage of ice is. Like, granted, we do have a drug problem. There's no doubt about it. It changes every day with designer drugs, with every drug changes. Every drug becomes more popular depending on who's using it and what cross-section of people are using it. But I can tell you, most DEA agents and even narcotics detectives will tell you, if they've been on any time at all, we're not arresting our way out of this. We're never going to arrest our way out of it. There's got to be something. And there's a big measure of this. Is this a social or a criminal problem? Are we doing this? And how the prosecutors view it now, I think it's great we have PTI for these people that are addicts. I mean, you have
PTI.
Pretrial intervention. So you have people sitting in jail. Probably half the people sitting over in Duval County Jail are addicts. Mm-hmm. And they're committing crimes related to their addiction. They're not being sentenced for that. They're being sentenced for breaking into cars, from stealing stuff out of houses, to prostituting themselves, you name it. But it boils down to addiction primarily.
Or mental health.
Or mental health.
Or both.
Or both. But even the mental health aspect of it, people get more help on the mental health side than they do on the addiction side. Trust me, I can tell you that. There's more avenues for them to get care than there is. You have two centers here. You have Gateway and River Region. Other than that, you got to pay a lot of money to go into a rehab.
And the disparity that we're talking about in sentencing, Shannon, I mean, it basically meant that they were targeting for the crack portion of their prosecutions users, and in the powder realm, pretty much people who were providers or sellers, just because you had to have such a greater quantity to be penalized at the level that a user was.
So
crack cocaine.
What we're talking about is like there's a charge, right? Sale or delivery of cocaine. And when you get to the point at which you are being sentenced, we have what are called guidelines. And it's this handbook where it started in 1983, and it would break down, how you classify this charge, if there's enhancements, if there's aggravating factors, if there's mitigating factors, and what the score is for that guideline. And it's very complicated. And, as a criminal defense attorney, that's something that we have to learn and we have to become very familiar with. And so it goes down to what even the charge is, like what you actually plea to is very important. And so when we talk about crack versus powder cocaine, especially in the 80s and 90s, and in fairness, I am also an 80s baby. So like I wasn't actually around when all this was happening, but we're seeing the fixes that are being put into our system right now to not have that distinction in order to remedy what's happened for the last 40 years, 35 years. And when we're going through those guideline scores, previously the change in a cocaine derivative versus powder cocaine was actually acknowledged and given an aggravating factor. And so it increased the sentence that someone would get because of the type of cocaine or the type of drug it was. And they've done this with different types of drugs, right? The quantity of drugs, there's fines that might be attached to the quantity of drugs. It might be a trafficking amount, etc. And so the entire process of prosecuting drugs, drug offenders, drug users, drug dealers has gone through so much change and so many iterations in criminal justice. And they're constantly trying to figure out the best way with, drug court, pretrial intervention. Do we address the symptom of drugs in our community? Do we go after the drug dealers? But the disparities that we were seeing in the 80s were directly related to this war on crime, this war on drugs, where if you were doing crack cocaine, if you were a low income, person of color who's addicted to crack cocaine, you were a much worse offender than, like Kevin was talking about, the people in South Beach who were doing lines of coke off the bar.
One thing that was...
Can I add one thing to that? The good thing also is that judges, even on a federal, I think on a state level too, on the guidelines, they can depart from those guidelines. The judges can look at it and go, I'm not doing that.
Right.
I'm not giving them 10 years. I'm not giving them 15 years. I'm looking at this person in totality and saying, this individual is living on the street or living hand to mouth. They have an addiction problem. I'm going to depart from that. And that's a good thing. Judges need to do that. That's their job, by the way. They should do that.
I want to ask you, though, Mark, because one thing that offended the Supreme Court here was not just the manufacturer of cocaine. It was the fact that the law enforcement officials deliberately sold it within 1,000 feet of a school. It increased the penalties that the people who were buying the drug faced. But as the justices noted in their final order, they were also creating an unsafe and and really kind of despicable situation for a school where, an already afflicted community where they're actually creating a drug market in order to do these busts.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like doing these. I'll be honest with you. I thought that it would be borderline or it was entrapment for a lot of it. I mean, I can remember hearing the undercovers and the conversation. No different than when you send an undercover out on some of these highways here locally in Jacksonville, females for solicitation cases. It's similar. I'm not saying it's right. A lot of, or wrong. I mean, you're talking about crime blighted areas, right? It's how you have to address this, right? Like I had a responsibility one time with JSO to clean up Springfield. Well, I can tell you, Springfield's still not cleaned up. Okay, but I had that responsibility, and we had a weed and seed initiative program, and we were supposed to go out and, all of a sudden you miraculously make a change there, and it just takes a period of time, but you have to do it the right way. We have to go after the highest violator, the people that are actually distributing the drugs, and not the addicts. The addicts, it's not working. So, yeah, these issues of drawing them near a school or drawing them near a church or whatever, and making sure the judges see that, by the way. Prosecutors know it too. So I think they've gotten away from that a little bit on those things. It's a slippery slope. You go down one way or the other.
And it still happens. I mean, there's still buy busts and not local law enforcement making crack cocaine or, whatever. But there are still situations where someone is purchasing within 1,000 feet and it happens to be an undercover officer. And now they've added not just schools, but churches and convenience stores. So the legislature has changed to include those locations as well. But, that does enhance your penalty from a 15-year penalty to now a 30-year penalty in a first-degree felony. And that greatly enhances the sentencing situation. So we do still see things like that happening. And whether it's manufactured in the sense that you are going to these places to intentionally lure people to that place and create more crime in those locations versus that is already where the crime is taking place. I don't know the answer to that. But certainly, if you do enough criminal defense locally, you do see a lot of these charges with the enhancement.
Yeah, and I got to say, at least from the people that are buying it, that's ridiculous. Now, the people that are selling it, I have no mercy on them. I mean, I'll be honest with you, they've trashed and ruined people's lives, and they care nothing about it, and they're making money off of it. And if we don't see it out on the street corners as much anymore because the drug trade has changed. I'm holding up a cell phone right now, right? No one can see me on the radio, but this is how people deal drugs now. It's almost like Grubhub or a delivery service. You don't have to be on the street corner anymore. And now it's more fatal than ever because fentanyl is just about in every substance out there. People may think they're buying Xanax or Soma or whatever it may be that they think they're Xanax or Oxy. Now the game's even higher, right? So on the selling end of it, I have no mercy. I'm never going to change off of that. But I can tell you on the buying end with people that are buying, it's just ridiculous to incarcerate people with that period of time.
Well, what about the retroactivity of this? I mean, you were saying, Shannon, the Florida Supreme Court decided this was illegal, what this Broward County Sheriff's Office was doing, but they didn't make it retroactive, which is kind of stunning. If they say it was actually outrageous conduct and a deprivation of due process and illegal, and it wasn't retroactive. But I'm just wondering, more recently, the changes to the sentencing that erased that disparity between crack and powder cocaine, also not retroactive.
Right. This is one of the toughest things in our jurisprudence, where there'll be an effort to change the law through Supreme Court case law, but it is not necessarily retroactive. And the flip side is true. People will, want things to be retroactive. That would be very bad for everyone. So this is just part of appellate law. I'm not an appellate attorney. I'm sure someone else could speak more eloquently on it, but it is one of the issues. And so the prosecutor in a county, the elected state attorney in a county, as the highest law enforcement official in that county, is the one who's going to be able to do the work to ensure that there's integrity in that conviction and that they have the absolute power to undo the mistakes of prior administration. We talked about politics. This was a big issue that came up when Melissa Nelson took over for Angela Corey. She ran against Angela Corey's policies locally, and our local prosecutor, for anyone who's not clear. And there were things that she has the power to undo, but she has not undone them because she doesn't want to create a precedence of constantly undoing the prior administration's
Such
work.
as, can you think of an example?
Well, one example is we have an integrity unit now. I think Shelley Thibodeau is still the attorney who's in charge of it. And we recently saw, or not recently, a couple of years ago, we saw two people who were, they were given, they were acquitted, vacate, set aside their sentences. They had served 40 years in prison. That was a huge story locally, nationally, in criminal defense especially. And so that was actually Harry Shorstein's administration, I believe. And I believe Hank Cox was the attorney who had prosecuted that case. So it was many, many years ago. And so that was one example where our local state attorney's office has an integrity unit.
I think that was an Angela Corey case, if I'm not mistaken.
No, because it was like 42 years previously. But in that situation, we know that there are attorneys in our local prosecutor's office who are working on making sure that there's integrity in convictions, and they actually will hear from inmates and they will look at their cases, and they're very selective in which cases they take action on. And they've spoken about this pretty publicly. Similarly, Harold Pryor is, he is making political choices where he's going to do something that happened in the 80s rather than, 2008 or 2018.
Much easier to do that.
Yeah, it's a little bit easier from a political standpoint. It's going to have a really positive impact, hopefully, on a lot of people. I mean, if these people are even living, this is a long time ago, and these were addicts.
The other part of that is you're going to if you seal these, it still pops up. I know I look at FCIC and NCIC.
Yeah.
It still pops up as sealed.
Yeah.
So people are going to ask the question. They're going to know something. I'm in favor of expungement, just getting it off the record so it doesn't show up for these people.
And they've talked about the fact that they're probably not eligible for sealing and expunging their record based on these particular charges, but they're going to help them get clemency if they're entitled to it. But the reality of the situation is if you're an addict in South Florida in 1988 to 1990, you probably have a lot more charges on your record. There's very few people who are going to be like a one-off crack buy and then nothing else.
This is true.
So unfortunately, I think the effort is well settled. I mean, they're doing it for the right reasons, hopefully. But it is a statement to say the court could not make the change retroactively, so we are going to make the change retroactively. It's just unfortunate that another administration, it took from 1993 to now, and another administration to make that choice. But this is why when we elect prosecutors, we need to make sure that they are committed to the integrity of their convictions, whether, it's from a prior administration where there was a clear issue with the convictions that were happening, or in their own administrations. If they make a mistake, they need to be willing and able to correct those mistakes because people's lives are affected.
And I think law enforcement has corrected it on their end. I've heard a few, you have 67 sheriffs in the state of Florida, and you have a lot of municipalities and police chiefs, and they will tell you, I'm not going to do this and make people guilty of something.
Mm-hmm.
We have enough crime as it is. We don't need to be doing this to add to it.
Right, because prosecutors, all of our state attorneys, have the ability to choose what they charge and who they charge. They do not have to prosecute anyone. They can make the choice to not prosecute someone. And that is in itself a political choice and controversial. But sometimes, especially in the case of children, they can choose not to prosecute maybe a very young child who committed all the elements of a crime, but they choose not to prosecute someone for a reason like that.
Well, keep in mind, most prosecutors have if it gets filed and it starts getting pursued, they have a zero defect mentality. They're going for the batting average, so they're wanting that conviction no matter what. So am I right, Shannon?
And that's a problem. I mean,
it's a big problem.
I think there's prosecutors who are like that, but there needs to be prosecutors who can take a step back and say what we thought was true. I mean, this was poignant just the other day with the whole Duke lacrosse team coming out that the offender actually admitted that, or the accuser actually finally admitted that she had lied. And Mike Nifong was not only removed as prosecutor, but disbarred because he was so adamant that incident had happened and he was just wrong. And he couldn't take a step back and see the forest for the trees. And so that's what we expect in our prosecutors to be able to, in the midst of a prosecution, if they get Brady evidence, if they get information where, maybe this isn't accurate, that they're able to take a step back, look at what's really happening and make good choices about whether or not they're going to proceed. And I think the time has changed. Times have changed.
Although you mentioned the Conviction Integrity Review Unit that we have here in the Fourth Circuit, which is Clay, Duval, and Nassau, but it's one of just 4 in the state.
Mm-hmm.
One of them being in Broward County. one being in Hillsborough and then one being in the Orange Osceola County District. But that leaves a lot of counties out in terms of having a prosecutor in place that is even thinking about these things.
Again, it comes down to the voters. It comes down to the community demanding that their prosecutor set up a conviction integrity unit because, they brought in a seasoned criminal defense attorney to look at prior convictions and see if there was a problem and really
You mean here in Duval?
Here in Duval County.
With Shelley Thibodeau.
Correct.
Yeah.
And, and it takes someone who's willing to ask really hard questions and to, look back at what happened previously. And a lot of what a prosecutor does is completely contingent on the then existing status quo of a community. What does the community want? What do the people of the state of Florida want at that time? And, what we want in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, and now is completely different, right? We just saw a vote on legalizing marijuana. And I think, 57% of Floridians are probably ready to stop prosecuting people for minor possession of pot. It's just not something that the community really cares about anymore. But in the 80s, very different.
And I think on that integrity issue, at least the unit that does that, a number of these, it's not whether a person is guilty of it or not, because by and large they may be, but it's a procedural violation, especially because they have ineffective counsel sometimes that doesn't do what they should be doing on their end. Say you get these 2255 motions in federal court, and a lot of them, end up getting a lawyer. And obviously, African-American violators primarily get court-appointed representation. They don't get the best representation, right? Prosecutors know that, so they go for the juggler on these type of cases and they're going to get them to plead to things that necessarily they, shouldn't be pleading to. But they have no choice. They're locked in. I think I'm right about that.
Well, I think you are right about what was happening. But I will tell you, especially in Duval County, our prosecution office is so diverse. Our judiciary is so much more diverse. Our public defender's office is excellent. I mean, these are some of the public defenders get such a bad rap because of, I think, bygone eras where people really did not get good counsel. But there are actually excellent attorneys in public defender's offices across the state.
Sure, some of the best, really.
And one just became a judge.
Yeah.
So, certainly they are very good attorneys. And there was a time, I think, in Florida, but since I've been practicing since 2010, I have personally seen the shift in the integrity, with Brady lists being more public. There is an effort, and certainly there might be prosecutors who are doing that in some of these counties that don't commit to integrity in their prosecution. But I do see a possibility where we will have all 67 counties in an area, in a space where the prosecutors are truly committed to the integrity in prosecution. And I look forward to that day.
Well, we look forward to having our local prosecutor on. She's going to be on in early January, and so this is something we can talk with her about. But Mark Baughman, Shannon Schott, thank you so much for being on today and talking about this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.